The Arizona Cardinals 2024 campaign is officially in the books, so in today's video, let's go ahead and start talking about their offseason and do my official mock offseason for the Arizona Cardinals. But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. We are on the road to 10,000 subscribers, so hit the subscribe button. Let's hop into it. So the way the video is going to work is we are going to be going over everything that the Arizona Cardinals are going to be doing in the offseason, beginning with their assets, whether we should restructure, extend, and do certain things to open up some cap space. Then after that, we're going to talk about their personal team free agents, who they should re-sign, who they should let walk. Then we'll go over some team needs, some free agency, and then at the end of the video, I'll be doing 2 3-round mock drafts for the Arizona Cardinals. Per usual, if you want to skip around in the video, there will be timestamps, but I do suggest just watching the full thing, or certain things might not make sense when we get time to mock draft. But with that all said, let's go ahead and begin with the team assets portion of the video. Now, when it comes down to the Arizona Cardinals, they actually have a lot of money to work with. They have $82 million in open cap space to work into the 2025 offseason. I will say a chunk of that money will go towards their draft class, so it is $82 million, but in reality, it's about $70 million you can really work with. This team also does have 5 draft picks as well. When it comes down to restructuring or cutting certain players, I actually don't think this team needs to restructure or cut any players. This is a rebuilding team, so it doesn't really make much sense to be restructuring deals, especially when you have $82 million to work with. Sure, you could restructure a contract like Kyler Murray, but you wouldn't really open up much money and you'd actually be kind of screwing yourself over. And there's really not any players that you could realistically cut and actually make a bunch of money off of. The only name that I really could come up with was Sean Murphy-Bunting, but you're not going to cut somebody who's a quality player on your team, especially if you're not gaining much money from it. By the way, everything financially that I'll be doing from this video is based off over the cap, so if I mess anything up, don't blame me, blame over the cap. However, we don't restructure, we don't cut any players, but we are definitely going to be handing out a couple of extensions to some quality players. The 3 players that I want to hand out extensions to are Jalen Thompson, Jonah Williams, and Trey McBride. Now, in terms of what contracts somebody like Jalen Thompson or Jonah Williams would get, I'm not too sure of. You'd have to ask somebody who's a bit more in touch with this team. But what I do know is that if you were to open up and extend those 2 players, you would gain $5 million this year for Jalen Thompson and $9 million for Jonah Williams' contract if you were to restructure him, and that money would be good for this year as well. Now, the interesting thing is going to be Trey McBride. He's currently on a rookie deal and he's going to be looking for a contract. So this is the one extension that I did come up with an actual contract details because of how good he is and the fact that he's probably going to be paid very similar to some of the top tight ends in the league. So because of that, this contract will kick in 2026. So none of this money will actually affect the team this year because he's still on his rookie deal. But the contract that I did come up with was a 4-year, $70 million contract. This would put him in line with some of the top tight ends in the league. If it truly is 4 years, $70 million, that would be about $17.5 million a year. That would put him in line with guys like TJ Hawkinson and Travis Kelce, and I do think Trey McBride is of that level. I would also suggest getting the contract out of the way now because the last thing you want to do is let this guy go out there and have another great year next year, and all of a sudden that 4-year, $70 million deal turns into like 4 years, $80 million, or 5 years, $100 million. So getting the contract out of the way now is probably something this team wants to do. They still have a ton of money to work with, even after this contract in future years, so they should get the deal done. But outside of that, with all the moves that we made, whether it's restructuring contracts and giving contracts out to some of your guys, I was able to manage to grow the $82 million to around $96 million to work with. Again, some of that is going to go to the draft class. So this team does have a number of very good free agents that this team probably wants to bring back. I will say there's no like superstars or anybody who is like, you gotta bring back like a Kyler Murray or a Trey McBride or somebody like that. But there are some names that I do think this team should consider to bring back. The names that for me are big name guys are guys like Kaiser White, Will Hernandez, Dennis Gardeck, Kelvin Beachum, Greg Dortch, Tristan Colon, LJ Collier, and Chris Barnes. Now, some of those guys are depth options. Some of those guys are true starters. I do think that some of these guys are going to become depth options as we go into the offseason. Some of these guys are starting now, but eventually I would like to replace them with potential upgrades. So of those guys that I listed who are currently in free agency, the guys who I would prioritize bringing back are just a handful of them. For starters, I would bring back Kaiser White on a 2-year contract worth around $12 million. That would put him at an APY of about $6 million a year. Kaiser White is a good player, but not necessarily a great player. He's actually pretty darn good in his run defense. He has a PFF grade of 73.0. Where he really struggles at is within coverage. He has a PFF grade of 32, which is just downright awful. With this team going through a rebuild phase, this is one of those guys who I think I'm willing to give a contract to for 1 to 2 years, but not necessarily a long-term deal, because more than likely I would like to find an upgrade in future years. That being said, you got to pay Kaiser White because you don't want to build a new team need just because you don't want to pay the guy that much. At 2 years, $12 million, you're not paying the guy a crap ton of money. That's about $6 million a year. I could also see the contract being a tad bit less. Next, I would bring back Will Hernandez. Now, unfortunately, he did have a pretty rough injury so far this year, but prior to the injury, he had an overall grade of 69.3 via PFF with a pass blocking grade of 74.2. And on over 163 pass blocking snaps, he had 0 sacks. So we're talking about somebody who is a quality player in the league. Because of the injury and because of the fact that he isn't necessarily a big name guy, I don't think we have to pay him that much to bring him back. I also do think he'd probably want to come back anyways. So because that, I'm looking at a contract worth 2 years, around $9 to $10 million a year. That would put his APY approximately at $4.5 to $5 million a year. Then there's Baron Browning. Now this one is really interesting because you traded for him this year. He came in and really didn't do a whole bunch. But at the same time, this is a guy who has shown some flashes of potential. He had 5 sacks a few years ago, 4.5 a few years ago as well with the Denver Broncos. It just didn't work out for Denver, and now with Arizona needing some pass rush depth, I think Baron Browning's a guy who has a little bit of potential who I would like to bring back. Because he is a potential guy and hasn't really put a whole lot on the field, you're not really going to have to pay that much to bring him back. And given the fact you did trade for him, this team is likely going to bring him back. So because that, I gave him a 2-year, $6 million deal with a player option attached to it. It's sort of one of those deals where it's like, we're going to give you $3 million this year, and if you go out there and ball, then you can decline your player option and then we'll think about a new contract. But if he continues with this trend and declines his player option, then he probably won't get a great contract, so he might just opt into his player option. This is the only deal where I put in one of those player option sort of things. I do think with a guy like Baron Browning, who is a potential guy who hasn't really shown anything quite yet, you'd be a bit okay giving him a player option. And then the last player who I think this team should bring back is going to be Chris Barnes. He's somebody who has played a couple snaps here and there, isn't a superstar, but is a depth option who you're probably going to want to pay because he's been pretty good for you. Again, he's one of those guys you don't have to pay a bunch of money to, but I'm going to give him around a 2-year, around $4 million deal. So after all these players that we're going to be retaining, that puts us approximately around $81 million to work with. Again, we got 96 after our restructures and after our extensions. Then we had about $15 million spent on retaining some players. So now we're at $81 million. So that then brings us to what are the team needs? Now, Arizona has a good amount of needs. I think their biggest need is offensive guard. Yes, you have Will Hernandez, but this team outside of Will Hernandez still has a couple question marks. Evan Brown is somebody who I'm not going to bring back. He's also a free agent, but I don't think this team should bring him back. Or if anything, you bring him back and then move him back to center. That all said, I don't think you should bring him back. I honestly think that maybe you should look in free agency for some interior offensive linemen, both guard and center. Next, and probably the bigger need outside of offensive line is going to be basically defensive line, whether it's a true top tier edge rusher or some help in the interior defensive line. This team was battered with injuries on the defensive line. Darius Robinson, their top pick last year, missed a lot of time, and then Ojulari also missed time as well. So they're going to get some guys back next year, but for sure you want to bring in some edge depth, some defensive tackle depth, get some guys who can actually play. Then I'm looking at cornerback. I think in this situation, more like a cornerback 2. Garrett Williams has been really good for this team, and yes, you have Sean Murphy-Bunting and Starling Thomas, but you can definitely find upgrades for both those guys as well. And then I also think this team should potentially be looking at a wide receiver 2 to add alongside Marvin Harrison Jr. I would say of all the needs this team has, that might be the least because you do have some guys who I do like, such as, of course, Greg Dortch. who in this mock offseason, I'm not going to bring back. I know that might be a bit controversial, but I think that there's some upgrades out there that might be better than him. You also do have Michael Wilson, who's also a pretty quality player as well, but I view him more as a wide receiver 3. So that then brings us to free agency, one of my favorite things to do in these videos. We're going to go over who I would bring in on this team and what contracts I would have for them. The very first thing that I want to do is just bring in a top tier interior offensive lineman to go in there and be one of the top offensive linemen on this team. We have a lot of money to work with, so we can really go for some big name guys. The player that I was looking at is Will Fries. Now, unfortunately, this year he has dealt with injuries, which might be a reason for concern and maybe a reason not to go after him. But when healthy, he's for sure one of the top offensive guards in the entire league. He had an overall grade this year, granted on a small sample size, of 86.9. He had a pass blocking grade of 74.9 and a run blocking grade of 84.9. That is, again, a small sample size, but basically throughout his career, he has been a rock solid offensive guard that I think this team could really use. Because we're talking about somebody who's coming off a major injury, and well, he is an offensive guard, so he's not going to get massive amounts of money, but you're going to have to pay him quite well. You're going to have to pay him as one of the top offensive guards, not necessarily the top offensive guard, but within the mix of some of the top offensive guards. So because that, I'm going to give him a 4-year, $60 million deal with an APY of around $15 million. Next is the defensive line. This is where the majority of my offseason budget is going to go to, primarily the interior offensive line. And we could really use some difference makers, some guys who can stuff the run while also producing a little bit in the pass rushing departments. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start this off by bringing in BJ Hill on a 3-year, $30 million deal. Now, BJ Hill is not like a Quinnen Williams nor a Christian Wilkins, but he is somebody who is extremely solid and very much so a guy that could be really used on this Cardinals defense. He has an overall grade on PFF of 70.2 with a run defense grade of 69.2 and a pass rush grade of 64.2. On the year, he had 39 solo tackles, 3 sacks, and 14 assisted tackles. Right now, the interior defensive line for Arizona looks like Roy Lopez and Naquan Jones, and sure, you got Bilal Nichols in there too, who's on IR right now, but not a whole lot of juice in that defensive line. I think BJ Hill would come in there, be a veteran to some young guys we might take in the draft, and just be a really good player for this team. Next, I wanted to find an edge that was somewhat affordable and somewhat young. Unfortunately, the edge rushers in this year's class are kind of old and maybe not who I think would fit this team. So with that said, I got 2 guys who I don't think is going to blow away Cardinals fans, but I do think that they could be impact players. One more so a depth option and one a full-time starter. I'll begin with the depth option just to get it out of the way. I think they should bring in Joseph Osai from the Bengals on a 2-year, $6 million deal. While Osai won't blow you away with anything in particular, he did have 5 sacks to go along with 27 solo tackles. Hook'em Horns, by the way, a former Texas Longhorn. He's 24 years old, so he is young. He's going to be a productive player on this team. Again, a rotational depth guy. He's not going to be a full-time starter, or at least you'd hope not. But then the big quote-unquote fish that I did want to bring in, again, this edge class isn't particularly great in terms of free agency, but I did want to bring in Chase Young from the New Orleans Saints on a 2-year, $18 million deal. On PFF, he has an overall grade of 66.4 with a pass rush grade of 66. He has 19 solo tackles, 4 assisted tackles, 1 forced fumble, and 7 sacks. So this isn't like a top tier #1 edge rusher that you're going to want to have, but I do think that it's a good start to pair alongside what you already have in Baron Browning and Ojulari. Now you have Darius Robinson who can play inside and outside. You also have Chase Young who could also do some similar things. Is it flashy? No. But I think it's a quality pickup that won't break the bank. The last player that I did want to bring in, who I actually read an article on that I thought made a lot of sense, and they name dropped the guy who I'm going to talk about now. The next player and the last player in free agency that I'm going to bring in, a big fish here, DJ Reed from the New York Jets, cornerback. His contract is going to be around 4 years, $68 million with a team option at the end. That puts him at an APY of around $17 million a year. Now he's undersized and he's a little bit older, but he's been just rock solid throughout his career. I think he'd be honestly a perfect addition to this defense. You put a veteran like DJ Reed alongside Sean Murphy-Bunting, the rising star in Garrett Williams, and then of course Buda Baker and Jalen Thompson. I think that secondary would become a really solid secondary, especially when you pair that secondary with some of the upgrades on the defensive line. But that is going to complete my free agency. Again, I want to recap here. We brought in Will Fries to shore up the offensive line. We brought in BJ Hill to fix up the interior defensive line. We got Joseph Osai as a depth edge option. I don't really think that that's that important, but you want to bring in some edge depth, of course. Then you brought in Chase Young, and then lastly, DJ Reed. After all those deals, we go from $81 million to $27 million. That little bit of extra money can go to just maybe bringing back a couple free agents I didn't talk about earlier, or bringing in some depth guys. Also, a lot of that will go to the draft class. But with that all said, let's now hop into our 2 3-round mock drafts. So as you can see, we have the PFF mock draft simulator going. I don't have PFF Plus, so there will be no trades. Eventually, I will get it once we get closer to the offseason, but I ain't paying like 20 bucks quite yet. So we address a lot of the issues in the offseason, obviously interior offensive line, some edge rushers, interior defensive line. I think for this mock draft, really what I'm looking for is trying to address the wide receiver room, maybe another interior offensive lineman, and if we can add a young interior defensive lineman, I'll definitely be down for that. With the way the board has fallen, there's actually a lot of really good players still on the board. I'm kind of actually interested to look at how this mock draft went. You got quarterbacks going 1-2, Abdul Carter going to the Jets, Emeka Egbuka going to the Falcons. I actually kind of like that, to be honest with you. Again, Cardinals at pick 16. So let's see. We got Nick Scourton, who I do like. Maybe not a top tier edge, but I do like Michael Williams here too. I'm just not really sure he fits Arizona Cardinals football. You could go with a guy like Ariante Ursary to put outside in your tackle room. Again, you do have Paris Johnson Jr., and you obviously do have Jonah Williams, but with Jonah Williams only signing a shorter deal with us more than likely, maybe you want to go with a tackle prospect like Ariante Ursary. You could also flip him inside to play guard as well. Of the names I'm seeing, I'm down to 2 players right now. Ariante Ursary to play our opposite guard from Will Hernandez. Obviously, Tristan Colon we did bring back, but he's probably going to be either moved to center or as a depth option, although he's been pretty good this year. I also do like Shamar Stewart and Kenneth Grant as well. Kenneth Grant, a more tier defensive line. Shamar Stewart, somebody who has a ton of flexibility. Kind of reminds me in some ways of Darius Robinson, but maybe a little bit higher upside. I'm not going to talk too long about it. I'm just going to go ahead and take Ariante Ursary to just add to the interior of this offensive line. Continue to build the offensive line. You can also play tackle if for whatever reason you want to move him out to tackle. Next up is the 2nd round. Now, Mike Green is available, but I have a sneaky suspicion that he won't be available in an actual draft setting. I think he will more than likely be a 1st round pick because of how productive he is as a pass rusher. So I'm just going to pretend that Mike Green isn't there because, again, he probably won't be available. With that said, I do actually like the idea of potentially looking at the edge, but I also want to look at the receiving core too. And I think there's a couple names that I actually really like here. Again, because we didn't bring back Greg Dortch, we need that Greg Dortch replacement. We have Marvin Harrison Jr., who's our number 1 guy. Then you have Michael Wilson, who isn't the fastest guy, but is a really productive receiver. I think he's more of a receiver 3. And then outside of those guys, you do have Zay Jones and Zach Pascal, but you're going to need another guy here too. Now, Savion Williams is an interesting prospect. He's a senior, 6'5", 225. He's a massive individual. Not necessarily the most productive guy though. As you can see, only 611 yards here, 573 and 392. So we're talking about maybe a bit of a project here. I like Xavier Restrepo as maybe just your pure slot receiver, a guy who can just consistently get open. Isaiah Bond might be that speedster, but I question his route running a lot. I actually kind of prefer Tej Johnson, even though Tej Johnson is freaking 5'10", 165. This one's interesting. You can also go Jaden Higgins, who's another massive individual, 6'4", 215, but actually a bit more productive this year. 1,000 yards, 900 yards last year. A go-getter, somebody who I really like. This is a really interesting situation. We could also look at interior defensive line. Obviously, we took the tackle last round, so interior defensive line, I really do like Alfred Collins. Deion Walker's a good player, and of course, if Derek Harmon is here, I like him here as well. I know some Cardinals fans might want to go wide receiver. I can definitely see it, but I think there's a couple better receivers later in the draft. I'm going to go with Derek Harmon here, actually. I think he's a bit more of a higher upside guy who I think is pretty similar to BJ Hill, but in my opinion, it might be a higher upside pass rusher. But that now brings us to the 3rd round. And again, I'm going to look at wide receiver. And ooh, I actually quite like Torrey Horton. Now, had some injuries this year, which is unfortunate, but 6'3", 185, really good player from Colorado State. I also like the idea of Evan Stewart as somebody who's just extremely fast. Unfortunately, not very productive throughout his career, especially this year with Oregon. A lot of expectations for him, but he didn't really play up to expectations this year. You could also look at Kyron Lacey, who has some off the field issues you might be a little concerned with, but is a high upside guy. I'll also throw this out there. I really like Jeffrey Bassa, and actually a couple mock drafts I did with this team earlier, I actually took Jeffrey Bassa in some of these mock drafts. This team could use linebacker depth, but I don't know. I think maybe in 2026, you might look more into the linebacking room to find upgrades over guys like Mack Wilson and, of course, Kaiser White. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and take Torrey Horton. I think his fit alongside Marvin Harrison Jr. is really enticing. All right, so that is our first 3-round mock draft. Let's go ahead and hop into another one. All right, so this time around, I won't go into too much detail about every single one of these picks. That said, Jalen Walker's on the board. That is a no-brainer in my opinion. Fills a need at linebacker while also filling a need as maybe a bit of an outside linebacker, an edge rusher as well. I actually think he can be kind of a flexible guy who plays both sides. So because we went ahead and took somebody who I think fills a bunch of needs for this team, I actually now am more enticed to go with the wide receiver in round 2. I don't think he's going to be there when they take their selection at, I think, pick 16. He's not going to be there, but if he somehow is, he could be a really good player for this team. But with pick 47, we're going to go wide receiver in this mock draft, and I talked about it last time. I really do like the fit of Xavier Restrepo. Bit of a slot guy, 5'10", 198, but finds a way to get open, has really sound hands. Really just, he's just somebody that you could rely upon to consistently get open and just make plays. Not the flashiest, not the speedest, or not the fastest, or I should say, but just open, and he'll get you some nice first downs. And then with this last pick, I'm kind of wanting to look at the linebackers here. Unfortunately, no Jeffrey Bassa. I do like Danny Stutzman. I also don't mind Kobe King, but I'm not sure I'm taking them here in the 3rd round. Let's look at the tackle. Maybe Donovan Jackson. He moved inside to guard for Ohio State, so I think we could potentially take him to be one of our second guards. But that then concludes our second mock draft. But that is going to complete our mock offseason of the Arizona Cardinals. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, anything like that, put it down in the comment section below. Again, road to 10K, so hit the subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.